For over 37 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll take a look at the military situation there. I'm Julian Repka, and this is Build Situation Room. And we begin in the southern part of the Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. There, the Russian army carried out the largest offensive in more than 2 months. We'll take a look at the footage and pause it shortly, as this here clearly reveals the situation that unfolded right before us. The 71st Brigade of the Ukrainian army, which was one of the brigades that aimed to repel the attack or successfully repelled it, to be more precise. In the background, we see Velika Novosilka, which fell to the Russian army in January, and we can observe all these vehicles moving around here now. There are at least 9 visible here just in this shot. We'll let it run for now and observe. Everything is moving to the left. The vehicles are moving to the left, and according to the Ukrainian defenders, there were a total of 3 main battle tanks, 18 infantry fighting vehicles, most likely of the BMP-2 type, an MTLB personnel carrier, and 41 motorcycles. We'll see those shortly too. And all these weapon systems, all these mechanized units, they launched an offensive assault from Velika Novosilka heading onwards. However, we're now observing that the Ukrainian army was indeed capable of preventing it, at least a significant portion of the vehicles. We're seeing that now, just now, they've been attacked once again, both by drones, by kamikaze drones of the Ukrainian army, and also by these vehicles are already in pre-established positions, previously laid minefields. Here as well, many vehicles have been lost. We are, however, seeing footage and images that we haven't witnessed in over 2 months, specifically of truly massive and extensive mechanized assaults by the Russian army with over 20 tanks and armored vehicles deployed here all at once. And that's something we haven't seen in a long time. And many assume that the Russian army needed the last 2 months to recover somewhat from the heavy losses which they had sustained earlier. We remember Kursk and Velika Novosilka were captured in January. Then things quieted down somewhat, and the Russians mainly advanced with infantry and also with Ladas and Butanka buses and so on, those small buses. So now, big attacks again. However, we're not just seeing tanks being deployed, but they've come up with the idea of using motorcycles too, 41 in total. To keep advancing the attack here, we'll take a closer look at the map shortly. The motorcycle attack was likely a diversion tactic meant to cover or distract from the other attack, as I mentioned. However, in the end, both attacks were completely crushed by the Ukrainian armed forces. We are indeed seeing some grim footage here. This once again shows that even the motorcycles, which can move relatively quickly, are not superior against the Ukrainian kamikaze drones. Here's another perspective from a new unit, which again shows that there are 7 tanks and armored personnel carriers visible in this image. However, we nevertheless continue to observe massive impacts here on the tanks and armored personnel carriers, and we can see that drones are indeed moving toward them, that some are also attempting to bypass the road. Here we see it, bypassing the road and then directly driving into a minefield that was set up alongside the road. Here we see it, and as a result, a significant portion of the deployed tanks and armored vehicles have been lost. It is once again, not entirely clear whether some may have actually made it in the end. Ukrainians are talking about 15 destroyed vehicles, but we did say at the start it was over 20. It's entirely possible that the Russian army has managed to reclaim new territories, but this has come at the significant cost of the massive losses we're witnessing here. Here again, it's clearly visible what we're not showing or only showing in very small parts. Of course, there were then attacks by the Ukrainian army with drones on the dismounted and in some cases fleeing infantry, which primarily dropped grenades targeting them effectively. For certain, dozens of Russian soldiers were killed here. Nevertheless, you have to look at the confidence, and it is truly remarkable. Not necessarily impressive, but undeniably notable to witness it in the 4th year of the war. They still raise the flag, boldly declaring, yes, we're Russians advancing in Ukraine, only to end up facing yet another disaster, as seen here. Alongside massive losses of around 70 to 80%, with troops killed and equipment destroyed long before they could even come close to reaching the objective. Now, we also see here that the Ukrainians, after deploying the drones, they've now proceeded to use cluster munitions. That means we're now seeing 155mm artillery, likely with cluster munition warheads. And we can observe that these areas were shelled, where here you can spot one of the tanks, where the tanks were halted, and where the infantry units had subsequently attempted to push forward further, to fight their way into the forest ridges in order to somehow survive there. We're going to take a look at the whole situation on the map. And as I mentioned, we're in the southern part of the Donetsk region. Velika Novosilka, as I said, the next larger town, which saw heavy fighting in December and January, was eventually captured. And what we've just seen was that an attack, likely the motorcycle assault, was advancing towards Novosilka, while the tank and armored personnel carrier attack was directed towards Wilna Pole. The entire area here is marked orange, indicating it's a contested zone, as per our map provider, Deep State Map. We currently can't confirm whether the Russians have managed to capture Wilna Pole or surrounding areas. We haven't seen any footage that shows them in those towns over there, at least. That means it's quite possible that a large part of the journey has already been covered. We saw it earlier. This is where it began. That city was in the background. Nevertheless, it remains the largest attack by the Russian army since January of this year. And we are seeing further major attacks by the Russian army. This means the spring offensive that many had anticipated, has apparently now begun. The Russians have regrouped. They've brought in fresh troops and additional equipment to the front. And we're examining additional footage, this time from Chasiv Yar, another city where the Russians are attempting to push forward. And here too, we can see that different vehicles are being used, mainly BMD-2 vehicles, which means they're being deployed by the paratroopers of the Russian army. These vehicles were spotted early. The Ukrainians detected the advance quickly. We now see the attacks just before the town of Chasiv Yar, but we'll shortly observe, and let's just let it play out, how some of the Russian armored vehicles managed to advance to enter the town, while we see here that more and more of them are being destroyed. And then, near the railway facilities or in the large industrial complexes which are naturally connected by railway tracks, they were destroyed there. We'll let that play out as well to get a better look. The Russians are back and still capable and willing to sacrifice all these vehicles just to gain a few meters, aiming to seize the next small village or what's left of it, now reduced to nothing but rubble and ruins. And here we now see how some of the tanks and armored personnel carriers, in this case just armored personnel carriers, have managed to reach Chasiv Yar. It's clear here. They came from the back, the eastern side, toward Bakhmut and tried to move westward, staying in the shadow of this building and along the railway tracks. However, this is where the last of the, roughly, it's not precisely known, 6 to 10 deployed BMD-2s were ultimately destroyed at this location. We can see the last ones there coming under direct attack, with some still burning nearby. This means yet another large-scale attack, still a major offensive. It has to be clearly stated, much bigger than what we saw in March and February from the Russian army, which has now been halted here at the end in Chasiv Yar. We'll take a closer look at the entire situation on the map, examine in detail why Chasiv Yar is so crucial for the Russian army, and observe then that by now a very, very large part of this city is under Russian control, around 80%. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians still hold a small part here. Chasiv Yar, we can map it out. The whole area was roughly this size. That's the entire city as it was. And we can see that a large part of it is under Russian control. However, this center here and some areas west of the center are still under Ukrainian control. And what we observed was the eastern assault, advancing through the canal area. And then, right here, the entire advance was halted and ultimately crushed by the Ukrainian military forces in the area. But it's not just their armored units that show the Russians are now in spring offensive mode, as we've just seen. The drone attacks are also becoming increasingly extreme and frequent all along the front. And now a significant portion of these attacks are carried out using fiber optic drones. We've witnessed these attacks in recent months, starting around Kursk, then spreading to Ukrainian regions, and now they're happening along the entire front line. We're looking at the footage, and once again we see how, well, one has to say, relatively defenseless the Ukrainians are against these attacks. This isn't footage of a person moving, of someone walking past a car, but rather recordings from a Russian fiber optic drone, a flying drone, which in this case now apparently first notices that this vehicle here is already turned off. You now turn around and spot an M113, a Ukrainian army troop carrier which has already been abandoned. Here, a net was specifically installed as a countermeasure against drones. However, the drone manages to fly directly into the open hatch here, the Russian drone. And now we witness the massive explosion unfolding before our eyes. Here we see the drones approach once again, the massive explosion of the M113. That means this vehicle has now been destroyed as well. We have, however, visually confirmed information from Russian sources. As I mentioned, it's visually verified that at least 80 armored vehicles belonging to the Ukrainians were destroyed in February alone. And that shows the wear and tear. It also shows this attrition potential, or the substantial wear and tear that's being caused by Russian drones and other weapons. Now, another fiber optic drone has been spotted in a Ukrainian-controlled village, not directly on the front line, with no active combat position in this area. But it's positioned behind the front, moving between 5 and 10 kilometers, and another, in this case, not armored, but a terrain vehicle, attacks directly in this area. Here is another vehicle from the same unit. We can identify it by these 3 lines, which are moving upwards in this direction, these 3 lines that are going upwards, and now we observe closely that the fiber optic drone, even inside this factory hall, now manages to attack this vehicle. In the end, particularly bitter scenes, I must say, as we can clearly observe here that an attack has already taken place quite recently. We're about to observe this fiber optic equipped Russian unit advancing toward a village where a Ukrainian M113 had been destroyed. There were apparently casualties. We, of course, have pixelated them, and these 3 soldiers are lying on likely a T-84, a highly advanced Ukrainian tank that was deployed to this extremely specific and precise location. To evacuate, this means the Ukrainians are making another attempt to rescue their wounded from the ongoing situation. We can see, however, that the whole operation didn't happen quickly enough, and now a new Russian drone is closing in. From this point onward, we'll pixelate the footage as wounded or possibly deceased soldiers are visible on the tank. And now we're seeing the approach of the Russian drone essentially setting up this ambush, just waiting for the evacuation to take place in order to target the evacuating vehicle, in this case, as mentioned, likely a very modern T-84, to attack and strike it as well in this specific situation. All of this shows us that the Russians have no shortage of drones, no shortage of high tech, and indeed, in close coordination with these newly deployed infantry units, most of whom, as we've seen, end up dying, along with the new tanks and armored vehicles deployed to the front, most of which are ultimately destroyed. They have these drones, not quite full superiority, but a substantial potential of kamikaze drones being actively deployed. They all work together. Keep in mind, it's not just mechanized units charging ahead, perhaps in a day to a certain point, but a coordinated effort. At times or in certain places, that's how it is. But overall, when you look at the battlefields, it's the Air Force, the drone forces, the infantry units, and the armored units all working in unison, who all attack in unison and overall have significantly contributed to Ukraine losing roughly 6 villages along the entire front line over the span of just the past 2 weeks alone in total. But the intense fighting is not only continuing in Ukraine, clashes also persist in western Russia's Kursk, even though the Russian army has claimed for months to have recaptured all settlements. We're looking at footage from the small village of Gornal. Gornal, a village right by the border, but as mentioned, it's in Russia. And here we see a religious site which continues to be firmly held by Ukrainian soldiers on Russian-controlled ground. The Russians are now launching an assault on this church and the pilgrimage site to drive out the Ukrainians stationed there. These are Russian recordings clearly demonstrating the operation's high precision as they're now just about to push out the Ukrainians. You can clearly see that the rocket has indeed caused significant destruction here. However, we also have Ukrainian footage from the same region, specifically around Gornal, showing how the Russians are attempting in parallel in this case to advance with a BMD-4. And we also observe that this attack ultimately fails. We just saw a mine that the BMD-4 initially drove over. Let's replay it. We see the explosion happening right under the tracks. Now the vehicle is being halted by that. And at this moment, the kamikaze drones come into action, completing the task and igniting this already burning tracked vehicle, this armored personnel carrier of the airborne troops, setting it ablaze right here. The fighting continues even within Russia's borders, despite its ongoing efforts to maintain the appearance of complete control and stability throughout its territory. That is not the case. Here too, we now have to pixelate, of course, because we see that, as always, not only the vehicles are destroyed, but afterwards the dismounted or, in this case, fleeing Russian soldiers are also attacked by the Ukrainians. Fighting persists not just in Gornal, but elsewhere too. And we have brand new material that clearly demonstrates Russia is still heavily relying on North Korea, actively seeking its ongoing support. And now we're going to take a look at these recordings. These are the very first ones that show us the self-propelled artillery of the Koksan type. A North Korean artillery piece, 170 millimeters, built since the 1970s, that these are not only on trains from North Korea that traveled 8,000 kilometers toward Ukraine, but that they are also being deployed. We now see here that these artillery pieces, which we had seen earlier in some videos, are indeed being used in the West and are being deployed so close to the border that they can indeed be hit by Ukrainian drones. Let's take a look at the whole thing. Here it says N2200. That's the heavy load symbol of the Russian railway. This means it also shows that these cannons were recently still on a train in Russia, were then transported on the tracks, and have now arrived at the border. We can now see these entrances from different perspectives as well. And what's interesting is that the Koksan has a range comparable to the 155mm NATO caliber of about 40 kilometers. The drones here definitely don't have that kind of range. That means they must have been driven very close to the border or the front line. These North Korean artillery pieces are apparently now meant to attack Sumy, to target Sumy. Nonetheless, the Ukrainians are trying to defend themselves. But this whole situation shows us that after 12,000 deployed North Korean soldiers, dozens of North Korean self-propelled artillery units are now being utilized. In this case of the Koksan type, which are also being deployed with the aim of attacking the Ukrainians directly. This ongoing arms alliance between the dictators Putin and Kim Jong-un continues to strengthen and develop. Let's take a closer look at this on the map. We've just seen the footage from Gornal, still under Ukrainian control here, and it was attacked from the direction of Gujevo, as we can see on the map. That was the route the Russians had attempted to take, though ultimately unsuccessfully, because at the very least, this BMD-4 that we saw was destroyed on the way there with the wrong troops on board. We'll stay briefly in the Kursk region, observing how the Ukrainian Air Force remains actively engaged and continues to shape the course of this war. years after Russia claimed to have destroyed the entire air force. And we now see here 2 deployments of a MiG-29. From the Ukrainian Air Force, which is actively using GBU-62 JDAM guided glide bombs from the US, first we see an attack on a large position where primarily drones are being launched and actively operated. Here it is again. It's a trench facility, but the focus isn't the trenches, it's actually all those structures behind them. We can also see all these antennas rising up here. So this is a sizable Russian trench facility equipped with drones that are launched from there. And we're about to see the MiG-29 getting active. Here it is, and you can see it performing that characteristic maneuver. That means it's flying in relatively low, then catapults upward, drops 3 GBU-62 bombs in this case, and tries to get out of the operation area as quickly as possible. Here we see the footage from a surveillance drone, which will show us just how extremely precise the impact of the 3 bombs is. The first, the second, and shortly after that also a bit further south here or further down in the frame. The third one, and we even have a second perspective that clearly reveals the extent of the damage. So it shows that indeed the entire position there was heavily hit or probably even destroyed by the Russians with all these drones. Here we can see the fires still raging, one here, one there, and one there. That means only one of the 3 bombs may be missed by about 20 meters. This one here, the others were accurate to about 5 meters, hitting exactly where they were supposed to. What I just said, we're staying in Kursk, is we're now going to see another GBU-62 attack by the Ukrainian Air Force, specifically on a large factory building in Chotkino. We see Chotkino, one of the cities right on the border, a larger city in Kursk, which was never captured by the Ukrainian army but is still being used for logistical purposes. Here as well, we're now observing a precise strike on a large industrial factory hall. Allegedly, the Ukrainians say drones were also stored inside here, which were supposed to be deployed shortly after. We cannot confirm that claim. However, we can clearly observe the precise hit directly on the roof of the workshop hall, effectively rendering the entire facility completely out of operation. Precisely the opposite of precise are the Russian attacks on Pokrovsk, and we have a new video, a Russian video, which shows us how. All 40 rockets from a BM-21 Grad launcher hit the area, around a residential area in Pokrovsk. Let's take a closer look at these recordings. They're truly quite shocking, I think. And the Russians, we must not forget, the Russians, they are deliberately publishing these recordings to simply show how they wage war. And they show absolutely no guilt about civilians being hit here. We're now observing here a drone, a kamikaze drone from the Russian army, actively scanning for potential targets in Pokrovsk. And this drone is flying right through the fire of a BM-21 launcher. We can already see the very first explosion in the background. Let's go ahead and play it, and we'll see, as I step aside here, that the residential buildings keep getting hit. Massive explosions striking the homes, plus there's a rocket incoming. Let's take another look. A rocket clearly strikes over here on the left side of the screen. Can you see? Here's the impact, and the rocket bounces off this house, flying straight into the neighboring building. That means we're likely dealing with massive civilian casualties there as well. Let's run it again. As I mentioned, here's the explosion, and now the drone continues to fly, and every few seconds we see all around these residential buildings, both on the houses and next to them in the allotment gardens and so on in these Dasha neighborhoods. Explosions everywhere. That means here we have around 40 rockets from the Russian military, which are, yes, absolutely indiscriminately fired at the edge of this former 60,000 inhabitant town. And yes, of course, there are Ukrainian soldiers defending all of this, but yes, of course, civilians are also living everywhere in those houses. We were recently at the front, very close to Pokrovsk, and saw that, of course, in every village and every city, even in Slovyansk, for example. Thousands, tens of thousands of civilians are still living there who, in this case, are being severely impacted by Russian terror and violence. Finally, let's look at another Ukrainian army innovation. Now, they have repurposed an ultralight aircraft. In this instance, not as a kamikaze plane like we saw earlier with the Aeropract that crashed, for example, in Grozny, but in this case, they have transformed a lightweight French-made aircraft into a bomber, specifically a bomber that is capable of actually handling Soviet bombs effectively. We look at the footage and see that Ukraine refers to this aircraft here as the Enterprise E-300. Zrenia, so that's the official name. And here we can observe a FAB-250 bomb, a 250-kilogram freefall bomb from Soviet times, being prepared for its intended operational mission. And this bomb is being placed under the ultralight aircraft. And I'll pause the video again in a moment because based on the footage, we can now see it. Here it is, extremely clearly, what it actually is. Based on the wings here, as well as the fuselage, and also here, where a pilot would normally sit, though in this case, of course not. By the way, down here is the bomb attached to it. This is a Sky Ranger kit, a French ultralight aircraft, relatively affordable. You can assemble it yourself if you order it. It costs around 30,000 to 40,000 euros. In the best case scenario, if you buy one that's a few years old, it only costs 15,000 euros. That means the whole operation is relatively affordable for Ukraine, which is currently utilizing this French-manufactured light aircraft to carry out bombing raids on Russian territory. And we're about to see that there are various launches. Here we see a vehicle driving across a field, as we can see, no road, a field, chasing after the aircraft while it takes off. Here's another scene now. It's different because we can see it more clearly this time. Here, I think you can recognize it. That's the median strip of the road. Here, the bomb is quite clearly visible. Here, there's no median strip at all, yet the bomb remains. That means two separate launches. Ukrainians demonstrate they've deployed these aircraft multiple times. We're seeing two different approaches now. On the right, a fuel facility. On the left, it's unclear due to the image quality. And we're seeing here, first on the right, a large explosion caused by the FAB-250 bomb dropped from an ultralight aircraft, and now on the left, another explosion. That means the Ukrainians have once again succeeded in repurposing essentially civilian material, in this case ultralight aircraft, in such a way that they transform these units into weapons and use them to attack Russia. Another explosion. It must also be said quite clearly, this is an innovation born out of necessity by Ukraine, which otherwise has no bombers of any kind, whether Western or Eastern, that could directly attack Russia.